My name is Chrissy Teigen, and I want to tell you a story. Not just any story, but the story of how I found my voice in the middle of silence, my strength in the midst of rejection, and my worth when no one seemed to see it. I still remember the first time I heard my mother speak with that kind of excitement. Her voice trembled with joy I didn't recognize.
"Oh, you have no idea how long we've waited for this. Finally a son."
Those words, innocent to some, were like a knife to my heart. I didn't fully understand what they meant back then. I was only 5, but I felt it. The shift, the way love was being rerouted in our family, the sting of suddenly becoming second best, a placeholder until the real prize arrived. Things changed almost immediately after that. My mother's belly grew, and with it the distance between us. My dad, he was barely home working long hours, but when he was, it was always about the baby, always the boy. One day, Mom called me into the kitchen. Her tone was sweet. Too sweet, the way someone talks when they're about to say something they know you won't like. "Chrissy, sweetheart, we need to talk." I climbed onto one of the chairs, my legs swinging, too short to reach the ground. "What is it, Mommy?" She didn't even look at me. Her eyes were on the countertop as she pretended to stir something. "You're going to stay with Grandma Rose for a while. Isn't that exciting? Mommy and Daddy need to get everything ready for your baby brother. You'll have so much more fun at Grandma's." And just like that, I was packed off like a piece of luggage, off to Grandma's house. Grandma Rose was my dad's mother, a retired English literature professor who lived in a house that always smelled like cookies and old books. Her home was small but filled with warmth. Unlike home, it had space for my voice. She listened. She paid attention. She asked about my day like it mattered. And for the first time, I felt what it was like to be loved without condition. We read books together on rainy afternoons, drank cocoa by the fireplace, and I learned how to bake from scratch. She told me stories of her students, her travels, her dreams. With her, I felt seen. Fully, beautifully seen. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. I was 7 when Dad came to Grandma's doorstep, his eyes avoiding mine. "It's time to come home, Chrissy," he said. "Your brother needs you." That word, brother, felt strange, foreign. As we drove home, the silence in the car felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. Dad tried to fill it with forced conversation. "His name's Ethan. He just turned 1. You're a big sister now. That's a big responsibility." I nodded, unsure of what that actually meant. I would soon find out. The house looked the same but felt unfamiliar. Mom stood at the door holding a pudgy toddler, her expression unreadable. "Chrissy, meet your brother Ethan," she said, her tone oddly formal. He had curly blonde hair and a goofy smile. He reached for me with one of those tiny, sticky hands, and I felt something tug inside my chest. "Hi, Ethan," I whispered. And just like that, I was no longer just a daughter. I became a live-in babysitter. My childhood dissolved into bottles, diapers, and sleepless nights, none of which belonged to me. While my friends were still learning how to ride bikes and play hopscotch, I was juggling bottles and balancing nap schedules. I was 7, and I was already learning that love in my home came with duties attached. "Chrissy, can you watch Ethan while I make a call?" Mom would ask, but it wasn't really a question. I'd say yes. What else could I do? I loved Ethan. Of course I did. How could I not? That little laugh, those gummy grins, the way he snuggled into my shoulder after a nap, it all melted me. But the weight of it all, it was crushing. My days became a never-ending loop of school, chores, and caring for Ethan. I tried to keep up with my homework, but it was a losing battle. Exhaustion was my new best friend. Then came the park incident. He was 2 by then, wild with curiosity. I bent down to tie my shoelace just for a second. 1 second. "Chrissy!" His scream split the air. I turned to see him sprawled on the ground, his knee bleeding. My heart dropped. I scooped him up, tears and panic clouding my mind. When we got home, Mom exploded. "How could you be so careless? You're supposed to watch him." "I'm sorry, No excuses," Dad barked, his face red. "Go to your room. We'll deal with this later." I ran up the stairs, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't fair. I was trying. I was just a kid. But they didn't see that, not anymore. There were more incidents. Ethan burned his tongue once on porridge because I hadn't cooled it enough. He bumped his head, falling off the couch when I looked away for a second. Each time I got blamed. Each time the punishments got worse. The disappointment in their eyes became a constant shadow. Grandma Rose was the only light left. She came by whenever she could. I lived for those visits. One afternoon, I overheard her in the kitchen, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard. "This is unacceptable. Chrissy is a child, not your live-in nanny. You're hurting her." "Mother, please." Dad muttered. "They're our children. We know what we're doing." "Do you?" Grandma snapped. "Because it looks to me like you're pouring all your love into one child and draining the other dry." "That's enough," Mom cut in. "We appreciate your concern, but we'll raise our children as we see fit." That night, I cried quietly into my pillow. Not because I was sad, but because someone finally saw me. Someone fought for me. School became my escape, my sanctuary. I poured everything into my studies. My grades became my secret rebellion. If they wouldn't love me for who I was, maybe they'd notice if I was the best at something. And I was. I soared. By the time high school ended, I was at the top of my class. College was calling, and I ran to it like it was my lifeline. The acceptance letter came with a full scholarship. I was going to study investment management. I raced down the stairs, the letter shaking in my hands. "Mom, Dad, I got in, full scholarship." "Oh, thank goodness," Mom sighed. "That saves us a fortune. We can focus on Ethan's college fund now." I smiled, but inside my heart broke just a little more. It was never about me, never had been. That was the moment I decided. This life, this pattern, I was going to break it, no matter what it took. College was everything I hoped for and everything I feared. The freedom was intoxicating, but the responsibility, overwhelming. For the first time, I had to figure out meals, bills, laundry, on top of a full course load. The money from my parents barely covered essentials, and I quickly learned to stretch every dollar. What helped keep me afloat were the small envelopes Grandma Rose sent, always with a sweet note and just enough cash to buy groceries or cover a textbook. 6 months in, during finals week, my phone rang. It was Mom. Her tone was clipped and cold. "Chrissy, just letting you know we won't be sending any more money. Ethan needs tutoring if he's going to get into a good college. We need to prioritize." I blinked at the screen like it had personally betrayed me. "But Mom, I'm barely getting by." "You're an adult now," she said flatly. "It's time you learn to solve your own problems." Click. Just like that, the last bit of support vanished. I was stunned. I hadn't asked for much, just enough to keep my head above water, but apparently even that was too much. The next few weeks were a blur. I worked 2 part-time jobs, one at a cafe and another filing records at the campus library. My grades began to suffer. I barely slept. I ate ramen noodles for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I was exhausted in a way that felt permanent. One night, I broke down and called Grandma Rose. I didn't mean to cry, but the second I heard her voice, it all came pouring out. "Sweetheart," she said, "you sound like you're drowning." "I am. I'm trying, Grandma. I really am, but I'm falling apart." There was a pause on the other end. Then her voice softened. "You focus on school. That's your job. Let me take care of the rest. I'm increasing your allowance starting next month, and don't you dare argue with me about it." I sniffled. "But..." "No buts, Chrissy. You deserve this chance. You're not going to burn yourself out trying to survive when I can help. Your parents have made their choices. Now let me make mine." Her words lifted a weight off my chest. I hadn't realized how heavy it had gotten until she took some of it away. Thanks to her, I could cut back on my hours. I started sleeping again. My grades climbed back up, and for the first time in a long time, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could do this. By the time graduation rolled around, I was walking across that stage with my head held high and a diploma in my hand. Grandma Rose was in the front row clapping louder than anyone else. My parents weren't there. Neither was Ethan. But I didn't let it ruin the moment. I had made it. After graduation, things began to shift. I landed a job at a top investment firm, Stonebridge Investments. It was the kind of opportunity fresh grads dreamed of: competitive pay, a big city office with a skyline view, and the promise of a real future. With my first paycheck, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I searched every used bookstore in the city until I found it: a first edition copy of Grandma Rose's favorite author. When I showed up at her door that weekend with the gift in hand, her eyes welled with tears. "Chrissy, my darling girl," she whispered, clutching the book to her chest. "You shouldn't have." "I wanted to," I said simply. "Everything I've achieved is because of you." We spent the weekend sipping tea, laughing, and catching up on life. I told her about my new job, my tiny apartment, my ambitious goals. When I mentioned visiting my parents, her face tightened, but she nodded. "I'm sure they'd be glad to see you." But when I called, Mom's voice was distant. "Oh, this weekend we're quite busy, Chrissy. Maybe another time." The sting of rejection still hurt, but I had grown used to it. I spent the rest of the weekend with Grandma instead. 2 years passed. My career soared. I earned promotions, bonuses, and the respect of my colleagues. Eventually, I moved into a sun-drenched apartment of my own. It wasn't huge, but it was mine. Every lamp, every curtain, every dish. I picked them all out myself. It was freedom in ceramic and fabric.
Then one evening my phone buzzed. It was Mom.
"Chrissy," she began, no small talk. "Ethan's professors are being so unfair. He's barely holding on at City College. He needs more support."
I bit back my instinctive response and tried reason.
"Maybe college isn't for everyone, Mom. There are other paths, vocational training, apprenticeships."
"Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "Your brother is brilliant. Much smarter than you, actually. He's just misunderstood. He'll prove everyone wrong." I let the insult hang in the air without responding. It wasn't worth the fight.
More time passed. One morning, Mom called again, her voice strained.
"Ethan's been expelled."
She launched into a familiar rant. Unfair systems, biased teachers, no one understanding his genius. I listened quietly, the weight of her denial pressing against me.
They'd spent thousands on Ethan's education, paid rent for a luxury apartment, bought him everything. All things I never had. "He just needs time to find his path," she finished. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I said nothing. Life had other plans for me.
At a company mixer, I met Jack. He was tall, sharp, and had this easy laugh that made me feel like the world wasn't so heavy. Our romance was fast, but it was real. We got married in a small chapel surrounded by people who mattered. Grandma Rose was there, glowing with pride. My parents showed up too, though their smiles seemed more forced than joyful. Ethan didn't come. He said he had plans. Jack and I moved into his apartment and made it our home. His parents, Tom and Ellen, were warm and generous, the kind of in-laws most people only dream of. I finally felt like I was part of a family that embraced me, not one that barely tolerated my presence. A year later, we found out I was pregnant. The joy was overwhelming. Jack's parents were over the moon. My own parents? Their first question was about the gender.
"Do you know what it is yet?"
Mom asked urgently.
"It's too early," I replied.
When we finally revealed it was a boy, their relief was palpable. "A grandson, that's wonderful news," Dad said. I tried to ignore how that comment pierced through me like a shard of glass. I focused on the nursery, on the little socks, on the crib that Jack insisted on building himself. Little Alexander was born on a rainy Tuesday. The moment he wrapped his tiny hand around my finger, I felt something inside me change forever. I held him close and whispered, "I'll give you everything I never had." Raising a baby was hard, but I had Jack. We were a team. And for the first time, I understood what love without strings felt like. Ethan, meanwhile, drifted. He took odd jobs, quit them, then started over again. He still lived with our parents, who now looked at him with thinly veiled frustration. During one family dinner, I gently suggested, "There's an opening at my company. Entry-level, but solid. I could recommend Ethan." Mom's expression turned icy. "Your brother doesn't need handouts. He's just waiting for the right opportunity." Dad nodded. "You were lucky, Chrissy. Things just fell into place for you." I sat in stunned silence. Lucky? They called everything I'd fought for. Every sleepless night, every exam passed while working 2 jobs. Luck. But I bit my tongue. Alexander babbled in his high chair, blissfully unaware of the tension. And in that moment, I saw it so clearly. Family isn't just about DNA. It's about who shows up, who supports you, who believes in your worth even when the world doesn't. Jack and I planned a trip home for Alexander's 5th birthday. Grandma Rose was our first stop. She adored Alexander, and the feeling was mutual. She showed him old photos, read him stories, and gave him cookies warm from the oven. As we were leaving, she pulled me aside. "Your parents have been struggling," she said softly. "Maybe it's time to let bygones be bygones." I nodded slowly, unsure but willing. The next day, we stood at my parents' doorstep. Mom looked tired. Dad waved from the armchair. Ethan was slouched on the couch. There were awkward hellos, forced smiles. Then Mom cleared her throat. "Chrissy, we need to talk." What followed was a halting explanation of bills, debts, Ethan's unemployment, and dwindling savings. "We hate to ask," Dad said, avoiding my eyes, "but we could use some help." I looked at Jack. He gave a small nod. I took a deep breath. "Okay, I'll send $2,500 a month. For emergencies, you can let me know." Their relief was immediate, almost desperate. And so I did. Every month, like clockwork. And when they asked for extra, for a broken water heater or a car repair, I sent that too. Part of me hoped this was the bridge back to something real. Thanksgiving came. We drove down to my childhood home. The house was full, relatives everywhere, Grandma Rose glowing,
and Alexander bouncing from room to room like he owned the place. At dinner, Mom and Dad couldn't stop talking about Ethan. "He's been working at his new job for 3 months," Mom beamed. "Bought those sofa cushions with his first paycheck," Dad added proudly. I looked around. New curtains, fresh paint, updated appliances, all things they could afford because of the money I'd been sending. I said nothing. Jack squeezed my hand under the table. Alexander tugged at my sleeve. "Mom, can I go play in the other room?" "Sure, sweetie, just be quiet, okay?" He ran off. Moments later, my phone buzzed. "Caller ID, Mom." I looked across the table. She wasn't on the phone. "Mom, why are you calling me?" She frowned. "I'm not. My phone's in the living room." Alexander appeared in the doorway, holding her phone. "Mommy," he said, confusion written across his face. "I found Grandma's phone and saw a funny name, Cash Cow. I clicked it, and it called you. What's a cash cow?" Silence fell like a hammer. The room froze, forks midair, eyes wide. Grandma's face was tight with fury. My parents had gone pale. My heart slammed against my chest. Cash cow? Is that what I was to them? I stood up. My chair scraped the floor. "Cash cow? That's what I am to you?" Mom opened her mouth, but no words came. Dad looked down at his plate. I scanned the table, voice rising. "For 2 years, I've been sending money every month, extra when you asked. Every curtain, every cushion, every appliance in this house, paid for with my money." Tears prickled, but I didn't let them fall. "I did all of it, hoping you'd finally be proud of me, that maybe, just maybe, you'd see me. But I was never a daughter to you. I was your fallback plan, your piggy bank." The room remained still. Jack rose and put his arm around me. Alexander, sensing something wrong, wrapped himself around my legs. Still no one spoke. Finally, Mom's voice broke the silence. "Well, of course you help us. We raised you. It's your duty. Don't be so sensitive over a silly contact name." A breath caught in my throat. "Duty? That's how you justify this? Well, guess what? I'm done. No more money, no more help, no more calls. I'm cutting all ties." Panic spread across Mom's face. Tears appeared instantly. "How can you be so heartless, after everything we did for you?" She looked around, hoping someone would back her up, but one by one, our relatives looked away. Then Grandma Rose stood up. Her voice shook with anger. "Heartless? You dare call Chrissy heartless? You've used her, belittled her, discarded her. I'm ashamed of you both. From this moment forward, you can forget about any inheritance. It all goes to Chrissy and Alexander." The room exploded. Mom sobbed. Dad tried to calm her. Ethan looked around, baffled. Jack whispered, "We should go." I nodded. We gathered Alexander and our things. I hugged Grandma, said a quiet goodbye to the others, and then we left. The calls started immediately. At first, pleading, then guilt-tripping, then screaming voicemails. When the threats came, I warned them I'd go to the police. Eventually, the calls stopped. I focused on healing. Jack, Alexander, and Grandma became my whole world. I threw myself into my career, into motherhood, into building a life rooted in peace, not obligation. Years passed. Word came that Ethan had run up debts. My parents sold the house to cover it. They now lived in a cramped apartment across town. And me? I felt nothing. No anger, no joy, just nothing. They made their choices. I made mine. One sunny afternoon, I sat on the patio watching Alexander play. Jack was beside me, his hand on mine. Grandma Rose sipped her tea, her laughter dancing in the breeze. In that moment, I realized something. I had finally found my place, my worth, my family. And no one, not the past, not their mistakes, not even my own pain, could take that away from me.